All right, this is a video of a review session that I normally have in person. And if you missed that, I'm making this video. This is review for IB seniors for paper 3. I want you to focus your review since you can't, cram every thing you learned in 11th grade into your head. To focus on the Mexican Revolution and the Great Depression. This video will focus on the Mexican Revolution. This is not designed to be the end-all, know-all that you need to know about about the Mexican Revolution, but it's a good way to get started. And people in the past have said it seems to help. This is basically I'm going to give you should have these guided notes here. Either gotten them from me or they're where I have this video. There will be an file attached as well that you can print out for yourself. This is a narrative, basically. I do not mean to imply that you need to learn the Mexican Revolution narrative and recount the narrative, and you'll make a 4 or higher. You could recount the narrative and just get a 3, but it is an important starting place. You have to know the narrative, to hang your facts on that, and to use it to answer the question, make and buttress your argument. So let's go. The Mexican Revolution. The cry was Tierra y Libertad, which it has many causes, but that's a nice quintessence. It's a multi-sided civil war from 1910 to 1917, really 1920, with socialist, liberal, anarchist, populist, and agrarian movements. Very complex. Now, Mexico began their struggle for independence in 1810. That's important to remember, or easy to remember, because they were celebrating their centennial in 1910, shortly before the revolution broke out. From 1810 to the late 19th century, Mexico was constantly involved in struggle. That struggle was generally between liberals who wanted liberal constitutionalism, American-type democratic values, and conservatives who wanted, central authoritarian rule. 3 big men dominated this time. One was Santa Anna. You learned about as a sophomore. He was the president of Mexico during the Mexican-American War, 1848, lost about half of Mexico. He was a conservative. Next up is Benito Juarez. He is a liberal and sort of one of the most revered figures in Mexican history. He fought and established a liberal constitutional government. It was a process called La Reforma. And the Constitution of 1857 was a pretty progressive American-style constitution, somewhat anti-clerical, tried to limit the power of the Catholic Church, which frankly was pretty undemocratic. In the 1860s, France and Britain put the Emperor Maximilian in charge of Mexico, an Austrian archduke, because Juarez had suspended debt payments. They didn't like that. Juarez kicks him out and restores liberal constitutionalism, but unfortunately dies somewhat prematurely. He is succeeded by the third great man, Porfirio Diaz, who was his lieutenant. Diaz started out as a liberal, a good guy, but got increasingly conservative and authoritarian over the course of about the 30 years that he remained president. This period is called the Porfiriato. So let's talk about some features of the Porfiriato. Economic development was Diaz's main concern. Mexico had lagged behind other Latin countries because of all this fighting, and so eventually his cabinet came to be dominated by a group called the Científicos. These were technocrats, economists, lawyers who wanted to promote economic development. And to do that, they had to invite foreign investment, and so foreign ownership soared in Mexico. Foreign interests, especially U.S. interests, owned more of Mexico than Mexicans did. There was also a concentration of land in the hands of a few people. Ejidos versus Haciendas. Ejidos were communal lands granted to be farmed communally. by the Spanish long ago. Haciendas were giant farms or ranches that were granted to white people by the Spanish, and Diaz allowed the hacendados to pervert a part of the Constitution of 1857 meant to limit, the ownership of land by the church, allow them to direct that law, twist it, and start taking ejido land. This swelled the number of landless Mexicans, and so we see a dramatic stratification of wealth in the form of land. Political repression was the other feature of the Porfiriato. Diaz did not, he didn't want to be violent. Pano palo was a famous policy. Bread or the club. I'd rather co-opt you and bribe you and control you, but if necessary, I will use violence. He ruled through a system of jefes politicos, which means political bosses. In every state of Mexico, he had local bosses loyal to him who controlled the machinery of government. He could be ruthless. Le fuga, which is the fugitive law, said that you could do extrajudicial killing if someone was trying to escape. So I've seen the number, about 10,000 people were shot while trying to escape. I'm using air quotes during the Porfiriato. He also had a rural police force. The highways were terribly unsafe, and so he sort of co-opted the bandits and made them a rural police force. It was another method of repression. So this results, inevitably in an explosion of revolution. In 1908, James Creelman was an American journalist who Diaz communicated with and had an interview, and said that indicated in 2 years' time, when his next term was up, he was not going to run again. That Mexico had advanced enough and people were intelligent enough that they could maybe elect their own president. He didn't mean that. He was just speaking, I guess, to an American audience. But it got excitement raised, and Francisco Madero, a rich but well-meaning hacendado from the north, from Coahuila, decided he was going to run for president. He stirred up so much excitement that Diaz had him jailed, and until the election was over, which Diaz won in a landslide because he cheats. And so Madero then says, you know what, we're not going to unseat this guy through democratic means. So he issued the Plan of San Luis Potosi, which was the place he announced this plan, which basically called for removing Diaz by means of revolution. Not much happened immediately, but there were two significant revolutionary movements already underway against the federal government. One was in Chihuahua, run by Pancho Villa. He was a former bandit who developed some really sophisticated military skills and developed an increasingly large army. In the south, in Morelos, a very indigenous, very poor state, but nonetheless very productive agriculturally, and so a lot of the ejido land had been taken. That insurrection was led by Emiliano Zapata. And so up in the north, Villa, with the help of a guy named Orozco, won a major victory in capturing Ciudad Juarez, which allowed him, it was on the border with the U.S., it allowed him to import weapons. And Diaz agrees to leave Mexico, and he goes into exile in Spain, and in 1911, Madero enters Mexico. Okay, so he could have just seized the presidency, but he didn't do that. He said, no, we got to have an election in 6 months, and De la Barra, who was a Porfirista, was named the interim president. And for those 6 months, he did some things really that would kind of poison the government against Madero. And so there's an election in October of 1911. Madero wins, huge landslide, but immediately angers really both the left and the right. It's the classic moderate who wins. The right doesn't think, the right thinks he's a crazy socialist, and the left thinks he doesn't go nearly far enough. And so Zapata, who initially said, okay, we'll give this guy a try, he continues in insurrection, and he issues something called the Plan of Ayala, Ayala being the village where he issues this proclamation that says we're going to have forced redistribution of wealth and of land, and by violence, if necessary. his insurrection was very violent. His Hacendado War. Um, a rebellion occurred in the north by Villa's old ally Pascual Orozco. Actually, was financed by rich hacendados, um, who again, thought Madero was some kind of crazy socialist. She wasn't. And Madero turns to the general Victoriano Huerta to suppress this Orozco rebellion, which he does, setting the dangerous precedent of Madero kind of relying on Huerta, who is a really thuggish person. Um, and in fact, he plots with the American ambassador Henry Lane Wilson and Porfirio's nephew Felix Diaz to take the presidency in a coup. This results in something called the Decena Tragica, the 10 tragic days, where there's an artillery duel between the forces of Felix Diaz and the federal government. Um, Huerta pretends to step in, and although Diaz thought he was going to be president, Huerta sends him off to be ambassador to Japan, and he becomes president. Um, and essentially kills Madero and his brother and the vice president Pino Suarez. They were, I believe, shot while trying to escape. So Huerta had some supporters. The Catholic Church, they wanted more authoritarian conservative government. They had a special mass celebrating his ascendance of the presidency. And the federal army, of course, supported him. He had grown up through that. But that was about it. So immediately a revolution starts up against him. In the Zapata, of course, continues, and Villa, and in the north, Venustiano Carranza, who's a bit older. He's a rich hacendado, more moderate, but he says he wants to restore the Constitution of the principles of the Constitution of 1857, which Diaz had kind of subverted the part about not having successive presidencies, and he issues the Plan of Guadalupe. Because he focuses on the Constitution of 1857, he allied with Alvaro Obregon and Villa. They're known as the Three Constitutionalists. And he calls himself the first chief of the revolution, but in reality, he doesn't. Sometimes Obregon and Villa do what he says, sometimes not. At one point, Veracruz is occupied by the U.S. government for a period of close to a year. They do that so that Huerta cannot import weapons from Germany, which is about to go to war in Europe. There's evidence that was true. Germany was doing that. So, but nevertheless, this looks bad. Here's another American intervention. But Huerta controls increasingly little parts of the country, and so he's forced to leave in July of 1914. Then we start what is known as the war between the generals. And this is really the most brutal part of the revolution. It's general on general violence. In August of 1914, Obregon marches into Mexico City. And so this rebellion against Huerta is kind of successful at this point. And so the generals all have a meeting at Aguascalientes and decide, where do we go from here? What happens to Mexico next? It becomes pretty obvious that there are two predominant camps in the war. One that are sort of moderate bourgeoisie types who want democracy but don't want to destroy capitalism. The other camp is more, no, we want redistribution of wealth. That is sort of Zapata and Villa, whereas the moderates are Obregon and Carranza. But everybody fights everybody. Then Villa and Zapata successfully occupy Mexico City. 1915 is called the Year of Hunger. Everyone now is swept into the revolution. It's really terrible. Carranza he sort of establishes provisional control of the country, but he needs to get rid of Zapata and Villa, and he convinces Obregon to plot this battle with Villa, the Battle of Celaya, which is a terrible defeat for Villa. He's not dead, and he doesn't go away, but he is essentially eliminated as a major military force. Obregon wins through superior strategy. Obregon is very smart. He does lose his arm in that war, in that battle. So Carranza establishes sort of a, you know, increasingly firm control over Mexico. He starts buying off generals and giving them land or government positions. Um, Villa, angry that the U.S. kind of begins to say, okay, Carranza is the guy, and they drop their support of Villa. They'd always been supportive. He gets angry and invades the U.S. in March of 1916, Columbus, New Mexico, kills a number of people. So the U.S. sends the punitive expedition, a military expedition of men under the uh, command of General John Pershing, Blackjack Pershing, um, but they never find, and it puts Carranza in an awkward place. He'd like Villa killed, but here the gringos come again, interfering in Mexican sovereignty. Anyway, they can't find him, and they go away because Pershing will soon have to lead the American Expeditionary Force to Europe. Um, Carranza says, we need to sort out what's going to happen, for the government of Mexico. So he allows this convention, 1917 Convention of Querétaro, to create a new constitution. He's not there, and is surprised because these guys that run this constitution, they're moderate liberal bourgeoisie types, kind of the same sorts of progressives that are in the U.S. right now, and they write a very progressive constitution. I would look into that and make some notes about the most significant provisions about allowing unions and protecting the subsoil for Mexicans. Um, Carranza sort of ignores this constitution, and Mexico has increasingly ignored parts of it ever since. But it is a great constitution. It does begin to create some progressive reform. Uh, Also, Carranza has one of his commanders eventually kill through trickery Zapata in April of 1919. So all of his enemies are gone, but it begins to appear that theoretically he's president from 1916 to 1920. It begins to be clear he intends to put a puppet in his place and remain in control in 1920. And Obregon says, "Oh no!" So he leads. He marches again south to defeat Carranza. Carranza flees and commits suicide. I'm using air quotes. Um, Obregon becomes president, and he continues the disarmament and bribery to bring peace to the country, and has some success with that. In 1923, it looked like Villa, who had been pacified by being given a giant hacienda, was going to try to re-enter politics, and so he was killed, probably by Obregon. Obregon did some slow land reform that the Constitution allowed him to do, but it was tepid. One of the main things of his presidency was his appointment of Jose Vasconcelos as Minister of Education. He dramatically expanded public education and public art, and espoused this idea of indigenismo, which is just Spanish for indigenism, a celebration of Mexicans' indigeneity. Whereas before the revolution, uh, that indigeneity was suppressed, and Mexico followed European forms of art and expression. That changed dramatically with the revolution. Um, then we have Obregon, another revolutionary general who's a lieutenant of Obregon, named Plutarco Elias Calles, becomes president from, he essentially rules Mexico from 24 to 34. He's president from 24 to 28. And then he and Obregon say, hey, let's amend the Constitution to say you can be president twice, but not successive terms. And let's make it a 6-year term because you can't get enough done in 4 years. And other countries do this. And so Obregon wins to be president in 28, but is shot in the face by a Cristero. The Cristero Rebellion occurred under Calles' presidency because he was the most anti-clerical of the revolutionaries and really angered the church. And so you had some kind of crazy radical Christians who fought this Cristero Rebellion. Calles, and so Calles basically puts a series of puppets over the 6-year term that Obregon would have filled. So he rules for 10 years. And this is called the Maximato because he was known as the Jefe Maximo, the big chief, the maximum chief. Um, He did more land reform than Obregon, but he began to get increasingly right wing politically, border crypto fascism. He did accommodate Americans on Article 27 of the Constitution that talked about protecting the subsoil wealth. Mexico relied heavily on the Americans to get all the oil out, and Calles compromised rather than risk war with America. It was pretty nasty at one point. And so at the end of the Maximato, he allows Lázaro Cárdenas, another revolutionary general who had been very successful ruling the state of Michoacán, and who was sort of the leader of the progressive wing of the PRI. He allows him to get the nomination. He gets elected president. He thinks he'll control him, but he doesn't. And Cárdenas kicks Calles out of Mexico. He did more land reform than anybody before him. He reorganized the labor movement and the government. He provided a lot of support for the peasants and for the workers, but in doing so, he really kind of co-opted them, and they became more increasingly dependent on this large government apparatus which was controlled by the PRI until the year 2000. He did not back down, as Calles had at one point with the Mexicans on oil. Has had Obregon before him. The Mexican Supreme Court said, "Hey, American companies, you got to pay this minimum wage to Mexican workers." And they said, "We can't afford it," and so he nationalized the oil company. But he is succeeded by a pretty conservative guy, and that's pretty much been the case through 2000. So what are the results of the Mexican Revolution? Up to 2 million dead. Which is about 4 times, I think, the American Civil War, which was the second most destructive war ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. Mexico, its economy was horribly devastated, and rebuilding would take a long time. A sense of unity, however, a Mexican national identity that embraced everyone, that did emerge. And the Constitution of 1917 is important, although, again, Mexico's government has implemented that in fits and starts. The PRI, the institutionalized version of the revolution, again, is an important feature, not really a good one, and some land reform. So there are 3 general groups that were participating in the revolution: progressive middle-class capitalists, people like Obregon, who was not rich, but he was he was a teacher. He was an entrepreneur. This group really, they wanted democracy. But they wanted capitalism preserved in a way that would provide some kind of throw some bone to the peasants and the workers. Then you had the campesinos, and their focus was on land. Zapata clearly is the heart of this group. And then finally you had a kind of a grab bag of cowboys, miners, that really just mostly opposed the centralized authority of Mexico in Mexico City. Villa clearly is emblematic of those. The last lectures we had were called Mex Rev Analysis Part 1 and Mex Rev Analysis 2. It tries to put a analytical framework over the revolution. I basically summarized the thesis of a book. And you should look at those 2 lectures. Just, go to YouTube, search Dale Wendell, Mex Rev Analysis. Those will be particularly helpful. So I hope that's a good starting point. Good luck. And this has gone on forever, so we'll stop.